Hi everybody, thank you for watching my video. Don't forget to hit subscribe. After the Romans departed from these islands to attempt to save the rest of their crumbling empire, Britain was taken over by numerous groups of foreign invaders, including the Angles and Saxons. And for 600 years, what we now know as England was divided into lots of smaller kingdoms, including Wessex, Mercia, and Northumbria. There was lots of fighting amongst the neighbouring kingdoms, but towards the end of the 8th century, the Anglo-Saxons had a different problem to think about. This problem came from Scandinavia, and they were called the Vikings. In 793, the first serious raid came on the northern island of Lindisfarne, with the Vikings ransacking the place and brutalising the poor monks who lived on the island. And that was just the start of things to come. And in the early to mid-9th century, the Viking threat gradually became more real and more constant. Before, the Saxons had fought amongst themselves, attempting to nick each other's lands and territories, but they, along with other kingdoms across Europe, now had to concern themselves with fighting off these horrid invasions. You'd be forgiven for thinking that the Viking attacks on England were a one-way street, and there was only one winner in these wars. But the Saxons actually fought back bravely, and every now and then managed to unify to beat their unwelcome guests. One thing that helped the Anglo-Saxon cause against the Vikings more than any other was the fact that there was a long line of great kings produced. One of these was a man named Athelwulf. He stabilised matters enough in his kingdom of Wessex for his sons to succeed him and to continue the good work. One of these sons included Alfred the Great, and as the Vikings continued to raid across England, Alfred began the real fight back. He won some great victories in battle, as well as taking some losses as well. Alfred was very fond of learning and education, and he realised the importance of teaching not only the children of the rich, but also of the poor as well, in order to produce a generation of boys who could lead the fight back against the Viking invaders. Boys of all different backgrounds and classes were taught how to ride horses and how to handle weapons, in order to prepare them for warfare against the Viking invasions. After Alfred died in 899, he was succeeded by two more great kings. These were Edward the Elder and Athelstan. They continued the unification of England, although it would only be in 954, during the reign of King Edred, when the north of England, in Northumbria, was a full peace finally reached, and Northumbria brought under royal control. The Saxon kings had done an excellent job of not only fighting back against the Vikings, but also of unifying all the different Saxon kingdoms into one. We now have the modern country of England. However, the long line of great Saxon kings would finally end in 978, when an extremely incapable king called Athelred the Unready became king. Athelred the Unready ruled for nearly 40 years. He was deposed for a time between late 1013 and early 1014 by the Danish king Svein Forkbeard. Athelred only regained the throne in February of 1014 after Svein died prematurely. He died himself in 1016, and the throne was now up for grabs. On one side, Athelred's son Edmund Ironside claimed the throne, and on the other, the son of Svein Forkbeard, Canute, rivaled him. Edmund earned his nickname of Ironside because of his military prowess, and he was as unlike his father as you could possibly imagine. Even though Canute was a fine leader himself, he knew he was up against it against Edmund Ironside. For months they cancelled each other out in battle, but the tide finally turned decisively in Canute's favour in October of 1016. The English and Danish armies met in a battle near Ashenden in Essex. The battle started well for Edmund's men, but it was won and lost not because of someone's bravery or brilliant decision-making, but it was decided by the treachery of a horrid little man named Edric, who had as much loyalty as a cockroach. Edric repeatedly switched allegiances between Edmund and Canute, and by the time of the Battle of Ashenden, he was supposed to be on Edmund's side. Edric, though, had other ideas. He started a false rumour that the English king had come a cropper. This caused the English army to fall into disarray, which is exactly what Edric had wanted. He seems to have been one of those men that simply liked to wreak havoc and watch the world burn around him. Because of his duplicity, the Danes won the battle easily. In the aftermath of this disaster for Edmund, a treaty was signed that essentially stripped him of true power. Canute was now top dog in England. Edric wasn't finished, however, and a matter of weeks later he is believed to be the man responsible for Edmund Ironside's murder. The story goes that Edmund was murdered whilst going to the toilet. I shan't describe the murder in too much detail, as it's a particularly unpleasant one. Canute rewarded Edric by having him executed. Even though Canute's enemy had been murdered and his path for total authority was now clear, Canute must have been thoroughly unimpressed by Edric's duplicity and pathetic behaviour, and he would have been well aware that he could not trust him as far as he could throw him. So Canute did the only sensible thing and had Edric removed. Canute was a strong and able king. His successors were his sons by different women. One was Harold Harefoot, and the other Harthacnut. Harold earned his nickname of Harefoot because he was supposedly fleet of foot. His half-brother, Harthacnut, is most famous for how he died. Whilst at a feast, he collapsed suddenly and died. Although there will be one more Scandinavian claimant to the English crown, the Danish dynasty that Canute and Svein Forkbeard had fought so hard for had ended suddenly. And aside from Canute's near 2-decade-long reign, it had been almost completely unsuccessful. In 1042, Edward the Confessor became king. He was the son of Athelred the Unready. During the reign of Harold Harefoot, Edward and his brother decided to return from Normandy, where they had remained in exile since their father's own exile in 1013. They had wanted to reunite with their mother Emma, who after Athelred's death had married Canute. But this trip didn't go well. They were accosted by the most powerful man in the country, Earl Godwin, who attacked them as soon as they landed. Edward had managed to escape, but Alfred sustained terrible injuries and died not long after. Edward did meet up with his mother, but decided, unsurprisingly, the wisest course of action was for him to go back to Normandy until his own succession in 1042. He was a religious man, hence his nickname, the Confessor, and this might explain his lack of an heir. However, no sons would prove to be faithful. As his reign went on, he would have had to have put some thought into who would succeed him. According to William, Duke of Normandy, who had every reason to lie, it was he who had been promised the English throne on Edward's death. This had happened supposedly in the 1050s when Duke William had visited Edward's court. I personally, though, doubt this very much. When Edward's father had reclaimed the throne in 1014 on the death of Svein Forkbeard, the English had obviously invited Athelred back, even though he had been a completely useless king. And despite Athelred's many flaws, he was still one of their own, which in the eyes of the English nobility would have been preferable to foreign rule, and I believe Edward the Confessor would have kept this in mind when he thought about his own succession. And so, the son of Earl Godwin, a man by the name of Harold, despite giving Edward grief during his reign, and despite what his father had done to Edward's brother, looked like the most suitable candidate to succeed Edward. He gradually became Edward's most important supporter, and Edward also married Harold's sister. Harold's ties were much closer to the English throne than Duke William's ever was. Edward the Confessor died in the first week of January 1066. Harold Godwinson stepped in and had himself crowned King of England, much to the irritation of William of Normandy, although not to any great surprise. There was also another claimant to the throne, King Harold III of Norway. He was said to have been 7 foot tall. Harold III had spent much of his life marching across Europe, and now had his sights set on England, although his claim to the throne was shaky at best. His was the first of 2 invasions in 1066, and after some early success, Harold III was defeated at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in the north of England. The Norwegian king died during the battle, and King Harold of England could now turn his attentions towards the next invasion, which came from the south. William of Normandy had been delayed by bad weather, but finally he arrived. King Harold made a terrible and stupid decision. Instead of delaying a while to give his men some much-needed rest and to replace the men who had died at Stamford Bridge, Harold marched almost straight away to meet the Norman Duke. William would have been delighted by this. If you invade a country, you're on borrowed time. The longer he was delayed in meeting Harold, the more discontent and hungry his men might have become, and disease could well set in. Harold had played straight into William's hands. We all know the story of the Battle of Hastings, so I won't linger here too much. The Normans had appeared at one point to be in retreat, only to circle back and surround the pursuing English soldiers who had broken away from the main army. It was during that part of the battle, after hours of fighting, that Harold died. Legend has it that he took an arrow in the eye, which is possible, but probably unlikely. With him died Anglo-Saxon England. Normandy became King William I of England, but conquering a country was not as simple as winning one battle. William's 21-year-long reign would be full of problems. The English were simply not ready to accept their new overlord and king peacefully, and they were led in their rebellions by a mysterious man by the name of Harold the Wake, whom we know very little about. One of William's main strategies in counteracting the English uprisings was to build a whole heap of castles called Motte and Bailey castles across England and Wales. But despite his extensive castle building programme, he continued to face uprisings, and the north continued to be the main source of his problems. In 1070, William sought to put paid to these rebellions once and for all, and he carried out one of the great atrocities of the Middle Ages in the process. Crops were burnt, animals were killed, and huge numbers of the northern population were massacred in what we now call the Harrying of the North. In 1087, as William lay dying, he is said to have shown remorse for these terrible events. But the Harrying of the North casts a terrible shadow over William's reign. He did leave some more positive legacies, such as the Tower of London and the Domesday Book. But it's hard to feel sorry for William, as he died a miserable and painful death in 1087. Two versions of his death are given, one more likely than the other. One thing is for sure, is that it happened as he laid siege to a town in France. William had been in poor health shortly before he set out for this last campaign. One version for how he died is that his horse had leapt suddenly over a ditch, thrusting him forward in his seat, so his saddle penetrated his stomach. Even though William had not been a well man for some time, and he was now largely overweight and getting on a bit in terms of age, I don't think this would have killed him. The second version is that he was thrown off his horse when it reared after standing on a hot ash from the town that was now in flames. A man in William's state would have suffered greatly from a fall like this, and I believe this version of events is far more likely. One way or another, William I died in agony, and as I've just mentioned, it's hard to feel sorry for him. That wasn't even the end for William. At his funeral, his body proved to be too big for the tomb it was supposed to go in. The men who were trying to bury him weren't very clever either, and they tried to squash him in rather than facing the facts. So forceful were the attempts at squeezing the fat old king into his tomb that William's stomach eventually exploded. You cannot think of a more undignified end for a once great king. But it proved to be even worse for the people attending the service. So bad was the smell that people are said to have had to run straight for the exits. William was succeeded by his third son as King of England. He was now William II. The oldest surviving son, Robert, was made Duke of Normandy, and the youngest son, Henry, got nothing but some money. Henry would bide his time, and he would eventually be back on the political scene. William II's reign was not overly successful, but his reputation was tarnished by the fact he didn't have a good relationship with the church. Churchmen were the ones who were responsible for writing the chronicles of the time, and if a king displeased them, or the church, the king's reputation would suffer duly. The most significant event that happened during William II's 12-year reign didn't happen in England. It was called the First Crusade. Pope Urban II had urged Christians across Europe to prepare for a venture to the east where Christians were suffering under attacks from Muslim invaders. The response was massive, and so massive, the Eastern Roman Emperor Alexius I, who had asked for help from the West, was overwhelmed by the number of arrivals into his empire. The crusade was successful in its end goal of recapturing Jerusalem. Among the leaders of the crusade was Robert of Normandy, who, in order to raise money for a massive expedition, handed over control of his duchy to William II, and off he went. In 1100, whilst Robert was still away, William died in strange circumstances. He was struck by an arrow whilst out hunting. Some say it was an accident, but William's youngest brother, Henry, was also in the New Forest when the incident happened, and he didn't stay to mourn his brother. 3 days later, he was crowned Henry I. Henry I proved to be a strong and capable king. He was particularly known for his good laws, which were even mentioned in Magna Carta, which was drawn up 80 years after Henry had died. But being a king involved a lot more than just administration. One of the highest priorities for Henry was to produce sons and heirs. If no children were forthcoming to a king, or only daughters were born to them, then chaos would surely follow. There was a snooty, dismissive attitude to the idea of female rule during this period, but the ironic thing is, if Henry's daughter Matilda had succeeded, as she should have done, then 2 decades of misery for England would have been avoided, and she would have done a far better job than her cousin Stephen did. Henry had one legitimate son as well as Matilda, and by legitimate I mean a son produced with his wife. Henry, though, really liked the women, and he had at least 20 illegitimate children, i.e. children with women who weren't his wife, and actually the number could have been as many as 24. This behaviour is not to be admired, and it would in fact come back to haunt Henry later on in his reign. In 1120, Henry was in Normandy, ready to sail back to England. He was in one ship, and his son and heir, William the Atheling, was on the White Ship. The royal party started their journey, but soon there was a problem, a major problem. The White Ship struck a rock and started to sink. The crew and their royal guests had thrown a huge party and had become very drunk. That was before they'd even set off. So bad were things becoming that a man named Stephen of Blois, the same Stephen who was to take the crown in 1135, decided to fake a stomachache in order to disembark. This proved to be a very wise decision on Stephen's part. The crew on the White Ship came up with a very stupid idea which would lead to the sinking. Due to their heavy drinking and partying, they were lagging behind the king's ship by a long way, and they decided they were going to try and overtake the ship. But almost as soon as they left the harbour, the disaster struck. William was bundled into a lifeboat and nearly escaped, but he drowned when he ordered the lifeboat to turn back to save his half-sister, Matilda. Not to be confused with his legitimate sister, the other Matilda. Almost everybody on the White Ship drowned. When the news of the White Ship sinking was brought to Henry, he grieved for the children he had lost in the disaster, and he also knew that the security of his dynasty was now at very real risk. After he had mourned for William and Matilda, his illegitimate daughter, the king was left with 3 choices: First, he could marry again. His first wife, another Matilda, had died in 1118, and so, if he married a young woman, he could hope to produce another son. Henry decided to do this, and he married a young woman by the name of Adeliza of Louvain. However, the marriage didn't produce the desired effect, and no children were born to the couple, perhaps not a surprise given Henry's activities. A second option the king had would be to make one of his illegitimate sons heir. He pondered this for a while, but ultimately he chose his legitimate daughter Matilda as his successor. As he lay on his deathbed, after he had ate too many lampreys, which his doctor had warned him would be bad for Henry, the king ordered his nobles to listen to his wishes for Matilda to become queen. He evidently didn't trust them. This was the third time he had made them swear loyalty to Matilda. 3 weeks after Henry I had died in December of 1135, Stephen of Blois had proved Henry's suspicions right and had himself crowned king ahead of Matilda. King Stephen was the son of Henry I's sister, and so grandson of William the Conqueror. If the nobles thought he would do a better job of ruling than Matilda just because he was a man, they were sorely mistaken. Stephen was a nice guy by the standards of the day, but a weak king. Matilda, her husband Geoffrey, and eventually her son, another Henry, would cause the usurper years and years of problems, both in England and in Normandy. Eventually, Geoffrey would conquer Normandy, and in 1141 it looked like Matilda might claim what was rightfully hers. At the Battle of Lincoln, Matilda's supporters, led by her loyal half-brother Robert of Gloucester, defeated Stephen and took him prisoner. The stage seemed set for Matilda's coronation. Matilda headed for London, but was driven out by the citizens of the capital. Her support was still not strong enough, and even worse, Robert himself was captured by forces loyal to Stephen. Matilda needed Robert badly, and so a prisoner swap was arranged. The king, along with Robert, were both released. After that, the two sides cancelled each other out until 1153, when a treaty was signed that agreed to make Matilda's son, Henry, heir to the throne. The country wasn't ready for a female ruler, but Matilda had done the next best thing and made her son king instead. A strong, determined woman was Matilda, and perhaps little did she know, she was the mother of the dynasty that would rule over England for over 300 years. This would become known as the Plantagenet dynasty. Henry II became king in 1154, and things appeared to be going well for him. He had made a tremendous marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine, and with her produced a number of sons that survived infancy. But as his reign went on, Henry found himself with more and more problems. One of the most famous of these was Thomas Becket, the man he had made Archbishop of Canterbury. Henry thought Becket would do everything that he wanted. However, Thomas proved to be far more obstinate than that. Almost immediately after gaining the role of Archbishop, Becket resigned from his role as Chancellor, much to Henry's surprise. And soon he was driving Henry up the wall with his stubbornness. In fact, the situation got so bad that in one outburst of rage, Henry threw himself to the floor and started chewing hay when he became uncontrollably angry at Becket. Thomas took the role of Archbishop very seriously, and he prioritized the church over what Henry wanted, which was, in short, to control the church and to have a greater say in the conduct of the clergy. Churchmen and clergymen throughout the reign of King Stephen had become incredibly corrupt, and that they were guilty of many crimes, including murder. Henry wanted to try them in his court, but Becket refused, and gradually the situation between Henry and Thomas Becket, one-time friends don't forget, gradually spiraled out of control. And unfortunately, on the night of December 1170, the situation came to a head. After Henry had had another one of his outbursts, 4 knights took the king at his word and murdered Thomas Becket at Canterbury Cathedral. This proved to be one of the most shocking events in medieval history and scandalised the whole of Europe. Henry knew he had dug himself into a hole, and so sailed off to Ireland for a bit until the storm had calmed down. On his return, he had himself publicly flogged as an act of remorse. Henry had other problems too, and this came in the shape of his own family. His sons, Geoffrey, Richard, their oldest brother Henry the Young King, and eventually their youngest brother, John, would go into open rebellion against their father, whom they accused of being a suffocating influence on them and would not let them wield true power themselves. They were encouraged to go into rebellion by their mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, whom herself was not pleased with the king. Henry II had alienated Eleanor somewhat by keeping mistresses, and Eleanor was not a woman who would take this lying down. When Henry found out that Eleanor had influenced the sons into going into open rebellion against him, he was furious and had her imprisoned for 15 years until his death in 1189. Henry II was succeeded by Richard I. Henry the Young King and Geoffrey had both died in the early 1180s. Richard is known as the Lionheart for his monumental achievements during the Third Crusade. The great Muslim leader, Saladin, had captured numerous Christian territories across the Middle East, and in 1187 he captured Jerusalem as well. This was a calamity for the Christian West, and again a crusade was preached. Richard I almost single-handedly reversed almost all of Saladin's gains, except for the capture of Jerusalem. Richard, though, had some serious trouble getting back to the west after the crusade had ended. On his way home, he had been kidnapped. The culprit was the Archduke of Austria, who handed over the English king to his enemy, the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry VI. Richard was only released after a massive ransom had been raised. His release was in no thanks to Philip II of France or Richard's brother, John, who had both done their level best to keep Richard in prison. Despite John's lack of loyalty, Richard forgave him, putting it down to John still being a child. At this stage, John was in his late 20s, so perhaps this gives an insight into how Richard viewed John. Richard died in 1199, struck by an arrow during a siege. He had spent around 6 months of his reign in England, and it's believed his queen, Berengaria of Navarre, never even set foot in the country at all. Richard I was succeeded by his brother John, who took the throne, despite the fact it should have passed to his nephew Arthur, who was the son of John's older brother Geoffrey. In 1204, Arthur disappeared in mysterious circumstances, and it's generally believed that John had had him killed. John's decision to take the crown proved to be a fateful one. He was utterly useless as king. He was outsmarted constantly by Philip II of France, and lost all the English possessions in France that had been built up by his father, Henry II. John was also cruel malicious, and greedy. The only good thing that came out of his reign was Magna Carta, which was essentially drawn up to keep him in check. So unpopular was John that the English nobles had even invited Philip II's son, Prince Louis, to invade and take the throne. Even after John died in 1216, and the throne had passed on to his son Henry III, Louis didn't give up on his claim and only accepted defeat when he was defeated by the quite brilliant knight William Marshal in battle in 1217. The English crown would have been in all sorts of trouble had it not been for the long life of William Marshal, who had served it so nobly for 5 decades. Henry III's reign was always destined to be a difficult one, given the problems his father had inflicted on the country. But as Henry's long reign went on, he too created his own difficulties. As later kings would do, Henry would have close friends, whom he favoured a bit too much. Henry was also dreadful with finances. One of his most stupid ideas was to try and put his son Edmund on the throne of Sicily, an idea which had been implanted in the king's brain by the Pope. The idea gradually became increasingly more and more far-fetched, but Henry struggled to let the idea go and found himself in heavy debt. Eventually, the country began to grow more and more sick of him, and in the 1260s he had a very dangerous dispute with his former ally Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. This developed into a civil war, and Henry faced off against Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Lewes in 1264. Henry was confident, but was wrong to be so. He was defeated, and even worse, his son and heir, Edward, was captured. For a year, England was ruled by Simon de Montfort, with Henry effectively deposed. It wasn't Henry, though, who got himself out of this problem. It was, in fact, Prince Edward. After spending considerable time as a captive, Edward became chummy with his guards, and one day went out riding with them. Edward was an accomplished horseman. He knew which of the horses would be quickest, and after persuading his guards to trade, he sped off on the quickest horse, and out of sight and on to freedom. He then restored royal power by defeating Simon de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham in 1265, where the usurping earl was killed and hacked to pieces. Henry III died in 1272, at a time where Edward, his heir, was out of the country. But the new king did not hurry back. In fact, he didn't return until 1274. He had been on crusade, where he had nearly died. A legend goes that he had fought off an assassin who had attempted to kill him with a poisoned knife. Edward, although he survived, had serious injuries, and it was only thanks to his wife, Eleanor of Castile, that he actually survived those injuries after she had supposedly sucked the poison out of his wounds. This is almost certainly a made-up story, but it's based on the fact that Edward was clearly fond of his wife. When she died in 1290, Edward was so upset that he had erected what we now know as the Eleanor Crosses on her funeral procession back to London. 3 of these still survive today, 2 in Northampton and 1 in Hertfordshire. Edward's reign, after he had finally returned from crusade and had been crowned, was dominated by wars with the Welsh and Scots. Although he is known as the Hammer of the Scots, the Welsh suffered no less from Edward's brutal military campaigns. Like William the Conqueror had done, Edward had an extensive castle-building program, which he used to subjugate troublesome areas, and this was primarily done in Wales. One of Edward's most gruesome legacies was a form of execution he saved for a Welsh prince named Dafydd ap Griffith. Dafydd was the first man of rank to suffer hanging, drawing, and quartering. Edward also had his problems in the north too, and the most famous of these rebels was a man named William Wallace. The English had both victories and defeats against the Scots, but Wallace was a constant thorn in their side. But in 1305, England got their hands on him, and he went the same way as Dafydd ap Griffith. This did not break the Scots spirit though, and in 1307 Edward died on his way north to engage the Scottish again. He was succeeded by his rather less capable son, Edward II. Edward II was not a man designed for kingship. He liked doing things like building walls, digging ditches, and talking to common folk. This behaviour was sneered upon by chroniclers who thought it ill-befitting of a king to behave in such a way. Because of reasons like this, it's kind of easy to like Edward II, but he was also a bit misguided. Growing up, he had a friend named Piers Gaveston, with whom he became very close to, and Edward started to ask for favours from his father, Edward I, on behalf of Piers. This did not go down well with the old king, who, having previously liked Piers, sent him away from the royal court, and gave a furious dressing down to his rather cheeky son. Piers returned, of course, after Edward II's succession. Soon this friendship began to grate on the wider population and even the King of France. Piers had grown too cocky. He started to overshadow Edward's queen, Isabella, who was the daughter of King Philip IV. She and Philip were not impressed by Edward's almost obsession with Piers, and Edward's nobles grew increasingly disaffected as well. Piers was sent into exile on 2 further occasions, but failed to learn any lessons. He even started to give his enemies nicknames such as the Fiddler and Burstbelly. Piers inevitably paid the price when he was captured by his enemies and was executed. Edward appeared to blame Piers for his own foolishness, but deep down he was devastated. Did Edward learn any lessons? Nope. He developed new favourites, the Despensers. And again, his favourites ended up dead, brutally executed. Edward could have been a reasonably good king, but he had terrible judgment, and it would lead to his own downfall. Having alienated his queen one too many times, Edward II was deposed by Isabella and her lover Roger Mortimer, and eventually murdered at Berkeley Castle. He was succeeded by his and Isabella's 14-year-old son, Edward III. However, Isabella and Roger Mortimer acted as regent. They governed in a selfish and self-serving way, and it took Edward III to use his own initiative as a young man in 1330 to overthrow the tyrannical government of his mother and Roger Mortimer. He held his mother as prisoner after capturing her at Nottingham Castle, and he had Roger Mortimer hanged at Tyburn. England could now look forward to a decades-long reign of strong, robust kingship under their young and energetic king. Unlike his father, Edward III was ready for a battle. He liked fighting so much he started a war that would last 116 years, although it's known as the 100 Years' War. Edward wanted to become King of France, and thanks in no small part to his son, the remarkable Edward the Black Prince, he gained great victories at Crécy and Poitiers, among others. Was he ever really close to claiming the French crown? Not really. Especially not in comparison to his great-grandson, Henry V. But his impact on English military history is very notable indeed. Edward also began a long process of English supremacy at sea with outstanding naval victories. All this glory, though, started to become undone as he grew older, and in particular after the death of his queen, Philippa of Hainaut. In the 1370s, after the death of his beloved Philippa, Edward, now an old man, suffered from poor health, and he was taken advantage of by a woman by the name of Alice Perez, who essentially helped herself to some of the royal riches. She became very unpopular indeed, but after Edward died, she fell into poverty, which basically serves her right. In 1376, shortly before the king died, the Black Prince, heir to the throne, died. He had also been suffering from ill health for a number of years. This was the consequence of almost constant campaigning. On a personal level, this would have been a tremendous blow to Edward III, but it would have far wider consequences than he could possibly imagine. The following year of 1377, Edward himself died. He had suffered a number of strokes, and his death mask, which still survives, and images which can be seen on the internet, show a droop to his face on the left side. Richard II succeeded his grandfather Edward III at the age of just 10. His reign would not be a good one, partly because he was a pompous little so-and-so who believed his own hype, but also in part due to events out of his control from the previous reign. In 1348-1349, Europe was overwhelmed by the Black Death. In England, around one-third of the population died. Beyond the tragic human loss, the Black Death also had other consequences. Common labourers became in demand, and so their wages grew higher and higher. The government didn't like this one bit, and so heavy taxation was imposed to deal with the inflation. Unsurprisingly, the poorer people were angered, as they had been earning more and more, and far more than they had ever done before. Attempts to limit social progress was always going to lead to trouble. Whilst Edward III was still king and in reasonable health, the rich could just about get away with it. However, with the boy now king, and taxes continuing to weigh heavily upon the general population, a rebellion soon became inevitable, and in 1381 it exploded. In Essex and Kent, the men and women marched on London, storming the capital and setting it ablaze. The young king and his court fled to the Tower of London, but much to their horror, the rebels followed them, and they forced entry, where they seized the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, and the treasurer, Robert Hales. Both Hales and Sudbury were executed. Another of the targets was John of Gaunt, Richard II's uncle, the richest man in England, but he was away from the capital at the time, and so the peasants had to make do with destroying his palace at Savoy. They nearly killed his son, Henry, too, but he had a narrow escape, and he would become king in 1399. The destruction would send shockwaves across the country. Eventually, the rebel leaders, including Wat Tyler and a preacher named John Ball, were killed or executed later, but the rebels had made a lasting statement that they would not simply tolerate abject poverty. Despite his tender age at the time of the Peasants' Revolt, where he was just 14, Richard II had played a key part in the ending of the rebellion, and from that point on, he would become insufferably arrogant. Like kings mentioned earlier, he'd fall out with his nobility, who tried to keep him in check. Richard was petulant and malicious, and he held grudges. He was also a very bad judge of a situation. In 1399, John of Gaunt died. He had been Duke of Lancaster, which then should have passed on to his son, Henry. Henry, though, had been sent into exile by Richard 2 years previously, and so the king decided to take the Duchy of Lancaster and keep it for himself. Richard then decided, for no real valid reason, to go to Ireland, leaving the perfect opportunity for Henry to return and reclaim his possession. It soon occurred to him that there was also an opportunity for more, and he gained enough support to depose Richard and have himself crowned king. Richard was starved to death at Pontefract Castle the following year of 1400. But Henry, now Henry IV, had a tough time of it. He faced rebellions. The two most famous of these came from Harry Hotspur and a Welshman by the name of Owen Glendower. Hotspur was a troublesome northern nobleman who was eventually defeated at the Battle of Shrewsbury in 1403. At this battle, Henry's son, Henry of Monmouth, took an arrow to the face. He survived, but it left a nasty scar underneath his right eye. Portraits were made of him after he had become King Henry V in 1413, and in them he is turned to the side, so you can only see the left side of his face. Glendower was a near-constant thorn in Henry IV's side. Henry's time as king was uneasy because of this, and he would have known, as soon as he booted Richard II off the throne, that he had left himself open to challenges to his authority, and that's exactly what he got. What helped him even less was his poor health, which also dominated the last years of his life, until finally he died in 1413. Henry V could have been one of the greatest kings to ever live if he had just lived a few more years longer, rather than dying at the age of just 35 from dysentery. In a reign that lasted just under a decade, Henry put himself on the brink of uniting the English and French crowns, which would have been one of the greatest accomplishments in medieval history. He had done this by battering the French into total submission. His military genius was best demonstrated at Agincourt, where even though the English were heavily outnumbered, Henry's quick thinking and flexible tactics, and not to mention his archers, won probably the greatest single victory in battle in England's long history. After setting France ablaze, Henry forced his enemies to sign the Treaty of Troyes, which saw him marry the King of France's daughter, Catherine of Valois, but also made him Charles VI's heir. And early on in his marriage, Henry had a son and heir, another Henry. Everything seemed to be going his way. Nobody expected Charles to live much longer. The poor man had suffered mental health problems for a long time, which got so bad that he eventually thought he was made of glass, and he went on rampages throughout his palaces. So Henry's death, just a matter of weeks before his father-in-law's, stunned the English and meant the French avoided the indignity of being ruled by an English king. Henry VI would be crowned by the English as King of France in 1431, but it meant very little in the end. What Henry V didn't realise was that his death would lead to absolute chaos in England over the next few decades. He had taken the country to the brink of glory and instead left it with civil war. Henry VI became King of England when he was only 9 months old. This led, obviously, to a long regency. He grew up to be a pious and mild-mannered man, and quite unlike his warlike father. It was during his minority government that the tide of the 100 Years' War turned decisively against the English, and it was a young peasant girl by the name of Joan of Arc who brought it about. She claimed that God had spoken to her and told her to drive the English out of France for good. The French king, Charles VII, although he hadn't been crowned yet in 1429, when Joan turned up, was sceptical of her claims But in her he could see a good propaganda tool that he could use, and between them they began to reverse the English success of Henry V's reign, and they restored national pride to France. And Charles was crowned that year. In 1431, Joan was captured and burned at the stake. At the end of 1431, Henry VI, now aged about 10, was crowned as the rival king to Charles VII, but it didn't mean much, and a couple of decades later, the Hundred Years' War was lost for good when the last English-held possession in France, aside from Calais, was lost. Henry's reaction to that was to fall into a type of coma. His eyes remained open, but he never moved, and he had to be force-fed. Before he fell ill, his wife, Margaret of Anjou, had become pregnant. When she gave birth, the little baby boy was brought to the king in hope it would stir him, but it didn't, and he remained like that for 18 months. It was a sad situation, and the country soon fell apart. The English liked to fight, and with the 100 Years' War lost, and not being able to fight the French, the English decided to fight amongst themselves, and soon a civil war broke out, which tore the country apart. On the one hand, you had the Lancastrians led, in theory, by Henry VI, but in reality by Queen Margaret of Anjou, and on the other, you have the Yorkists led by Richard Duke of York, who had grown fed up of the poor governance under Henry VI. Battles were fought, won and lost, with family members fighting other family members. The Yorkists mainly held the upper hand, although Richard was defeated and killed at the Battle of Wakefield at the end of 1460. His mantle was taken up by his son Edward, who proved to be a brilliant military leader. He was so good he was never defeated in battle, and he would become Edward IV. Edward IV proved to be a mediocre king at best. He lacked the ruthlessness to truly establish his authority on the throne, especially during his first reign. He also was capable of making big political errors. He shocked his nobility by marrying, out of the blue, an obscure woman by the name of Elizabeth Woodville. He had been expected to marry someone from a more prestigious background, perhaps a foreign princess, but instead he had married for love. One man who was particularly unimpressed by this was the Earl of Warwick, known as the Kingmaker for the role he had played in putting Edward IV on the throne. He had been negotiating on the king's behalf in France for a potential marriage. This episode had made him look foolish. Pride-dented, Warwick did the unthinkable. He united with Margaret of Anjou to overthrow Edward. They did this despite the fact they hated each other. For a short time, this unlikely union worked. They launched an invasion of England and drove Edward IV out of the country, and temporarily restored Henry VI as king. However, it didn't last, and Edward IV gathered himself and returned to recapture his throne. Henry VI in 1471 was killed at the Tower of London. He had been a simple, kindly man who was simply not fit to rule. Edward IV probably knew this, and perhaps this might explain why it had taken him so long to remove Henry for good. But he could not allow himself to be usurped again. Henry's death was very sad, but it did bring an end to the worst part of the Wars of the Roses. In the second phase of Edward's kingship, he began to overindulge himself, and he grew steadily fatter. His grandson, Henry VIII, would inherit this trait. As a result, he died prematurely, aged just 40, in 1483. You may have noticed by now, but history definitely repeats itself. Another king had died before his time, and left his young son, now Edward V, as king. Young Edward had an uncle called Richard, who was his guardian, and he would look after him, and also his brother, wouldn't he? Edward V and his 10-year-old brother, Richard Duke of York, disappeared from the Tower of London in 1483, having been locked up there by their uncle Richard Duke of Gloucester, who had had them declared illegitimate. The Duke of Gloucester then had himself crowned king in place of Edward V. He was now Richard III. This was truly a diabolical but calculated act. There have been numerous theories put forward to explain the boy's disappearance, but the only logical one is that their uncle, their guardian, was the man behind it. Richard, throughout his political career, had been a fine soldier, and on the surface anyway, he had appeared to support Edward IV loyally. He was a sharp man, and he would have known full well about the goings-on in his kingdom. Any plots against the boys he would have heard about. They should have been safe in the Tower of London. No plot should have been able to reach them or harm them, but evidently they weren't safe. A couple of 100 years later, after they had disappeared, some bones were found in the Tower of London. They appeared to be those of two young boys, and they were declared at the time to be those of Edward V and his brother. They were buried in Innocents' Corner in Westminster Abbey. Of course, we don't know for sure if they were the boys, but one day it's hoped that the skeletons will be examined to possibly identify them, and if it is in fact Edward V and his brother, perhaps find clues to their fate. Despite other crackpot theories that include the boys escaping overseas, the fact remains that they were killed. And Richard, even if he wasn't directly responsible, did nothing to prevent their tragic fate. It suited him to have them out of the way. He had wrongly usurped Edward V and now needed to secure his fragile authority. But thankfully his reign didn't last long. In 1485, Richard was defeated by an obscure man by the name of Henry Tudor. Henry himself had a flimsy claim to the throne, but thanks in part to the role of his remarkable mother Margaret Beaufort, he managed to beat the odds and defeat Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. With the succession of Henry Tudor came the birth of a new dynasty and the end of the Plantagenets.